Hey everybody, how's it going? Happy New Year's Eve. And I'm coming to you with a brand new whiteboard video less than 2 hours before the start of the new year for me. So I was thinking about what I could make this video on, and then I realized there's only one thing I can make this video on. It's the end of a decade. I got to talk about the Seattle Seahawks team of the decade for the 2010s. Who were our best players? What does our all-decade team look like? These questions need to be answered. And a lot of this stuff might be obvious, but not all of it is. It's worth a discussion. So, in my last video of the decade, slash first video of the new decade, depending on what time zone you're in, we're going to be taking a look at the best players of the 2010s for the Seattle Seahawks. And if you want to interject with a change, an addition, a subtraction, adding another player I forgot, maybe pulling out a player you don't think was so good, let me know in the comments. But let's try to figure out what we got. First of all, this should go without saying. This only takes into account contributions done in this decade. So starting in 2010 through now, plus probably whatever happens in the postseason. But whatever happens in the postseason this year is unlikely to change any of this stuff significantly. So we'll just go with it. Number two, if you want to start at the very top, general manager. There can only be one general manager of the decade for the Seahawks. We've only had one general manager, basically. We've only had one head coach. So Schneider and Carroll obviously had the team. Offensive coordinator has to be Bevel. He was offensive coordinator for most of the decade. We had some very good years with him. And defensive coordinator is probably Dan Quinn. We burned through a lot of defensive coordinators this decade, but Dan Quinn is probably far and away the superior of them all. So let's go through the players. We're going to do first team, second team, and then honorable mention. I went the whole 9 yards. All right, quarterback. First team, obviously Russell Wilson. I don't even need to qualify it. Second team, this one's kind of tough. On the one hand, Matt Hasselbeck started in 2010, went 7-9, missed some time to injury, but then he made the playoffs and won a playoff game. Tavares Jackson started in 2011. That team went 7-9. He missed a couple games, but he stayed on the team after that season as a backup, played well in some garbage time, and won a whole bunch of coin tosses. So I can go either way. I went with Matt Hasselbeck because of the playoff win, but Tavares Jackson was on the team longer. You could easily go with him. And the only other guy you could even consider is Charlie Whitehurst. Next, running back. And for some reason, all pro teams, all NFL teams, all decade teams, all whatever teams have two running backs in the starting lineup. So that's what I did here. Yeah, I don't know if it's reasonable or not, but two running backs per team. First team, Marshawn Lynch, obviously, easy pick, and Chris Carson is the other running back. It's pretty darn obvious, right? Chris Carson is the only non-Lynch running back who has had multiple full good seasons as a starter for the Seahawks. Second team, Thomas Rawls, because he had like 20 really kick-ass games for the Seahawks. And the second running back on the second team is Rashad Penny because he's had two very effective years as a backup running back. And I mean, it's very close between some of these running backs on the back end, but I went with Penny. The honorable mentions are Christian Michael. He had a handful of quality games in Seattle. And the last honorable mention is Justin Forsett. He had a couple of good seasons in Seattle as well. Other guys who could have made this team would have been like Robert Turbin, Eddie Lacy. That's really about it. Back end of running back for the Seahawks this decade was kind of ugly. Fullback, Michael Robinson is first team. He was the Pro Bowler fullback that we had. He made a Pro Bowl for the Seahawks. He was the lead blocker for Marshawn Lynch that worked so well, and he became a bit of a Seahawks legend off the field because he continued to work with the team even after he retired. Plus, he played on the team that won the Super Bowl. Second team, Derek Coleman. He had a couple good years as a lead blocker, even made some plays in the running game and passing game, and he was also on the team that won the Super Bowl. And Lastly, honorable mention, Trey Madden. He's the only other fullback I know of who played significantly for this team. Uh, the only other guy you could put up there is Nick Bellore, and I don't think there's a good argument for him. Wide receiver, once again, two wide receivers per team. So the top two receivers are pretty obvious in my opinion. Doug Baldwin, he had the two best seasons of any Seahawks receiver this decade, probably, and he had several other really good ones. He was on the team most of the decade, 8 seasons, I think. And the other receiver is Tyler Lockett. Finally, 1,000-yard season, but he's had several other really effective seasons and really stands out as somebody who has contributed at a pretty star level in terms of efficiency his whole career. Second team wide receiver, I have Golden Tate in the first slot. He had a lot of really nice seasons here, but he never had a Pro Bowl season because we didn't pass the ball enough. And then Jermaine Kearse, he never had big numbers, but he made a ton of big catches in playoff games and important games for the Seahawks over his, what was it, 5 years here. And honorable mentions would be Sidney Rice. He never lived up to his contract and then he got hurt, but he did have some good games. And Big Mike Williams. He was on the team at the start of the decade. Didn't last that long, but he did some good stuff. Honorable mentions would probably be Paul Richardson and honestly DK Metcalf. One season on the team, and he's already next in line. Tight end of the decade. Number one would be Jimmy Graham. He had the best season by any tight end in Seahawks history by far in 2016. He had another good season that was cut short by injury, and one season where he became the greatest goal line wide receiver in NFL history, pretty much. Just catching 1 yard touchdown passes like it was nothing because we had no running game. Second place is Zach Miller. He gave us a few very nice seasons when we brought him in from the Raiders, and then he got injured, and we basically never saw him again. But he was on the team that won the Super Bowl. He made a catch in the Super Bowl, so he's second team. Honorable mention is Luke Wilson because he was on the team a lot. I mean, I think he's been on the team like 6 seasons. People out there shooting off fireworks to celebrate the new year, I guess. Just don't know if you could hear that. But Luke Wilson is honorable mention. Guys who you could have put on this honorable mention instead of Luke Wilson would be like John Carlson, uh, Will Dissly, and his 10 career games or whatever it is. I don't like it. Uh, Left tackle. So specifically left tackle, we have Russell Okung in the first slot. He made a couple Pro Bowls in Seattle and started on the team that won it all. Second team is Dwayne Brown. It's pretty close, though. Dwayne Brown has had an all-pro season in Seattle and been pretty solid in the 2.5 years that he's been here, basically. So, not a lot of longevity in Seattle, but he's made up for it with some quality, in my opinion. And honorable mention is George Fant. He's filled in a little bit. He's been the sixth offensive lineman in a lot of packages, and he even fills in a little bit at tight end. After George Fant, I don't even know who you could consider. Maybe like Luke Yokel, but he mostly played guard, so I don't even know. Left guard. Okay, so first, James Carpenter. He was flawed. He wasn't even here that long. He was only here like 4 seasons, but solid, good road grader, run blocking left guard. Second team, it gets really thin at left guard, guys. Like, this is kind of sad. I wrote down Alvin Bailey because he was on the team for 3 years and started some during the Super Bowl year, but honestly, you could even argue Mike Upati needs to go here just because it gets a little thin at left guard, I cannot lie. And honorable mention is Mike Glowinski because he was on the team for a couple years, and I guess he's been pretty good in Oakland, but not much here, I can't lie. All right, center. First team, Max Unger. He was on the team that won the Super Bowl, had a couple of Pro Bowl seasons with us. I think he started the decade with the Seahawks, and we traded him after the 2014 season. A lot of people still regret that trade. I don't really, but he was the best center of the decade for the Seahawks. Second team is Justin Britt. He immediately slotted into center after Unger left, and in my opinion, played pretty darn well for the second half of the decade. And honorable mention is Joey Hunt because he's really the only other center we've had start games other than Britt and Unger. So Joey Hunt. Right guard, first team has to be J.R. Sweezy. I mean, he has started a lot of games at that position for the Seahawks, and he's been probably pretty average, but he was the starter when we won a Super Bowl, and not a terrible player at all. Second team would be DJ Fluker. He's only been here 2 years, but we've gotten some good stuff out of DJ Fluker, and he stayed relatively healthy too. So he kind of gets that spot by default. Honorable mention, I don't know. I wrote down Ethan Posick, but it could be you could pull out Luke Jokel and put him in this spot, and I would feel fine about it. So yeah, I don't know. The guard spots for Seattle this decade have been kind of bad, and finally on offense, right tackle. I put down Brino Yakamimi because he started for the team that won the Super Bowl, but he was only here 3 years. You could easily put in Jermaine Ifedi because he's been here for 5 years and started every game, but he's not good. We all know that. Jermaine Ifedi has mostly been bad since he's been here. And he is second team, though. And honorable mention would be Gary Gilliam. Uh, he played a few games, and he caught one of the biggest touchdown passes in franchise history, so there you go. We're moving on to defense, but if you take a look at this offense, the offensive line gets really thin really fast, but that's pretty darn good. I mean, if you were to make an all NFL, all decade team, Marshawn Lynch would probably make the first team, and maybe Jimmy Graham, just because of what he did with the Saints, would probably make second team or honorable mention. So we got some studs there. We got some guys who defined the decade. All right, defense. Defensive end, we got two defensive end slots, of course, because we play that 4-3. Michael Bennett is the number one defensive end, followed closely by Cliff Averill. Both of them entered the team in 2013 and had some stellar seasons. Like, the numbers don't even really account for how good some of those guys were while they were here. And even though Averill and Bennett left us a little earlier than we might have liked, for one reason or another, stellar seasons from those guys. Second team defensive ends, Chris Clemens and Frank Clark. Clemens, we kind of forget about how good Chris Clemens was because he was injured the Super Bowl year, but Chris Clemens was really good for the first 3 years of the decade for the Seahawks. And Frank Clark obviously was a guy who we developed as a rookie, and he went on to have 3 really solid seasons for us before moving on to another team. Honorable mention defensive ends. This one's a little tough. I have Raheem Brock. He had some production for us very early in the decade. And Jadeveon Clowney is the last honorable mention. The other guys you could have put on this list would have been Cassius Marsh, Red Bryant. But in my opinion, Clowney was a stud this year until he got hurt. And his level of play this year far exceeded anything Cassius Marsh ever did. So I gave him the last spot. Defensive tackle. Number one has to be Brandon Mebane. He was the definitive defensive tackle for the team that won the Super Bowl. He was somebody from the old Holmgren era that carried over and helped us win games. Second defensive tackle is Jarron Reed. The season Jarron Reed had last year for the Seahawks is probably the best single season any defensive tackle has had for this team of this decade. So Jarron Reed is also on first team. Second team, Tony McDaniel and Clinton McDonald, just guys who, worked hard in there, beat people, and just did the dirty work. We didn't notice them a lot, but they were in there working hard, helping us win games. And honorable mention is tough. I have Jordan Hill and Quentin Jefferson here, but Poona Ford has made one hell of a push to say that he belongs on honorable mention. Jordan Hill had like 8 games where he was awesome, and then we never heard from him again. Quentin Jefferson has been solid for the past couple seasons. This year he really flashed a little bit, in my opinion. I think Poona is probably more deserving of an honorable mention spot here now that I think about it. But Poona also doesn't play that much, and he's only been on the team 2 years, so it's up to interpretation. But I have Jordan Hill and Quentin Jefferson here. Okay, linebacker. And The first three spots, in my opinion, are obvious. The number one linebacker on the first team is Bobby Wagner. He's probably a first team All Pro of the decade for the entire NFL as well. So Bobby. Next is KJ Wright. And between those two guys, that's pretty much all of the good stuff we've gotten from linebackers this decade. But they've been so good, it's been fine. Now, the other first team linebacker would have to be Bruce Irvin. He did get a lot of sacks. He was a playmaker. He was an athlete. I like him. He never lived up to the first round pick, but he was a good player. I liked having him around. And then you get to the second team for linebacker, and it gets tough. I have on the second team Leroy Hill. He gave us a couple good seasons at the start of the decade before he moved on. Malcolm Smith, because he had a great month of football during the most important month of his life and won Super Bowl MVP. And then I have Brock Coyle, special teams stud for a really long time for the Seahawks. And then third team, it gets really tough. But I have Lofa Tatupu as the top honorable mention, Austin Calitro as number 2, and Kevin Pierre-Louis as the third honorable mention. Mostly a special teamer again. The only guys you could add to this that I didn't account for, maybe you could put like Michael Kendricks in honorable mention. Maybe you could put another special teamer in there that is slipping my mind right now, but I don't like Kendricks, and I feel like Kevin Pierre-Louis was a decent special teamer for us for a few years, so I think he's the guy. But back end of the linebacker is pretty thin. Okay, cornerback. Cornerback, this one's going to be fun. Number 1, Richard Sherman. Obviously, Richard Sherman is the best cornerback in the NFL for this decade, much less this team. Obviously, I don't even need to qualify it. It's pretty clear. Cornerback number 2 is tough. I went with Brandon Browner because he made a Pro Bowl and he had a couple really nice seasons with us, but I mean, he didn't play that long here. Luckily, his play didn't really deteriorate all the way until after he left. So I put Browner at number 2, but you could argue that Byron Maxwell could be slotted in there, even though he only started like a couple seasons for the Seahawks. He made a big play in the Super Bowl against the Broncos. He had a couple really nice seasons, and then he moved on. And then he actually came back in 2017 and gave us some depth when we really needed it. So I went Byron Maxwell as the top cornerback on the second team. The other cornerback spot is Walter Thurmond, my favorite Seahawks nickelback of the Pete Carroll era. I think Walter Thurmond was the best nickel cornerback Pete Carroll ever had. It's too bad he retired early, really. And on the honorable mention side of things, for cornerback, I did Shaquille Griffin because he's had 2 good seasons and an outstanding season as a number 1 cornerback. And Jeremy Lane rounded out the honorable mentions because he was a really solid nickelback until he got hurt. And then after he got hurt, he was trash. But for a few years, he was really good at nickelback. The only guy I would put here instead of Jeremy Lane would be Justin Coleman, and that's pretty close for me. But Jeremy Lane was on the Super Bowl team, so I gave him the nod. Safety. So let's start with a free safety. Earl Thomas, obviously the free safety of the decade for not only this team, but the whole league. Second team, Bradley McDougald. He kind of plays both safety spots. I understand that, but I put him in as a free safety so we can get on the second team because other than the 2 big guys, Bradley McDougald, in my opinion, has clearly been the best safety of the decade for the Seahawks. And last honorable mention would be Tedrick Thompson because there haven't been that many guys to play snaps at free safety for the Seahawks other than Earl Thomas and Bradley McDougald. It's really Tedrick Thompson, and I guess you could throw in Marcus Blair, but he's played like 2 games. Tedrick's trash, but at least he has the snaps. And finally, for defense, strong safety, number 1 is obviously Cam Chancellor, first team. He might be on the all-decade team as a second teamer, maybe an honorable mention. Lawyer Malloy is the second team just because he taught Cam so much about football and was the starter for that first year of the decade. And Honorable mention is Delano Hill because he's the only other guy who played significant snaps at strong safety. And he's trash, but it's okay. We've had a couple really nice safeties this decade at strong. So that's the defense. Special teams, real quick. Kicker, Hauschka, obviously. He was the kicker for most of the decade and was really good. Second team kicker would be Olindo Mare. He gave us a couple good seasons before Hauschka got here, I think. And honorable mention would be Jason Myers. He gave us one season this year and he was pretty okay. He was pretty solid. The only other guys you could consider there would be Janikowski and it can't be Blair Walsh, right? So it has to be Janikowski, if anybody. Punter, pretty easy. Number one, John Ryan. He was the punter here for 8 seasons of the decade and was good for most of them. Second team is Michael Dixon. 2 solid years as a punter for this team. 1 outstanding year, actually. And I don't think anybody else has punted for the Seahawks this decade. If I'm wrong, and Matt Hasselbeck did a pooch punt one time or something, then I guess it would be him. But I don't have an honorable mention for punter. And finally, return specialist. First team Leon Washington. That dude was a beast at returning. Some of the kids out there might not remember. He was before the Russell Wilson era, but Leon Washington, amazing return man for the Seahawks for a couple years. Second team, Tyler Lockett, he had one really great year as a return man as well. And finally, honorable mention, return man, return specialist, Golden Tate. He had like a couple years where he returned punts, and he did a pretty good job of them. All right, that's the whole team. That's the team of the decade. This defense is stacked. The offense is good outside of the offensive line. I go to war with this team over most teams of the decade. I'll say that. But did I miss anybody? Did I overrate anybody? Did I underrate anybody? You guys let me know what you think down in the comments. And yeah, that these are the fruits of the labor of the last decade for this team. And this decade has seen 8 playoff appearances, I think 9 playoff wins, going on 10 this weekend, a Super Bowl, another trip to the Super Bowl. It's seen a ton of Pro Bowlers and All Pros, one of the greatest defenses of all time, maybe the greatest multi-year run by a defense of all time. Pretty sweet. So let's think about this for a little bit, and then we shift our mind into the future. Specifically, what are we going to do against the Eagles? All right, peace.